join me for Expanding Our Roots. The whole purpose of this interview series is to give you an opportunity to share your story, talk about your journey, and to also talk to Louisiana and the rest of the world about what you do to make Louisiana a better place to live and what you do to show how Louisiana is a place of problem solvers and diversity and not just a place that is a problem to be solved. I'm always asking a lot of like complicated, very deep, multi-layered questions, but I never start with a question like that. The question I always start with is very, very simple. And that question is, where are you from?
Well, I am from Baton Rouge, Louisiana, through and through. Born and raised here. My family isn't from here, actually. My father and mother moved here in the 1960s. But I grew up on Stanford Avenue, and my mother had a preschool in our home when I was young. And I think this is a really important part of my development and formation, was that I have 4 brothers, so there's 5 of us. And she realized at a certain point that she was an educator, but she was staying home taking care of her young children because she had plenty of them. And she realized that it didn't make sense to just take care of us when she could certainly like open up our home and take care of other children as well. So I'm from a home that was kind of a community center and preschool. She started to go across, so this was like the early 70s, I guess. And so she started to go across the railroad tracks, which, you know, in all the senses, like the literal railroad tracks in South Baton Rouge, over there on Roosevelt Street, knocking on doors and asking people if they wanted to enroll their children in her free Montessori preschool that she was creating at our house. She'd been reading Maria Montessori, that's my mom. And so she created her own Montessori school, like in her home, and went every single day and picked up like 15 kids whose families enrolled them in her preschool. And so I'm from this place too, within Baton Rouge, of a lot of border crossings, because really that's a border crossing. Like I grew up in South Downs, a neighborhood that's named after Confederate generals. You know, all the streets, you know, are named after Confederate generals, a very white middle class kind of space. My father was a chemical engineer at Dow Chemical, and you know, kind of led that sort of middle class existence. But my mother was driven to really, like, she was just driven by social justice kind of thinking and her Catholic liberation theology readings and study and ways of looking at the world to cross some borders that I think a lot of people didn't cross at those times. So she and many other people like collaborated with one another to create the Big Buddy program. So I grew up inside of those contexts where I saw these adults struggling together to think about how to shift the community that we live inside of and how to connect people that weren't normally in connection with one another. And that was always sort of through this youth lens. You know, it was this lens of like doing things with young people. And so I got to be a part of that, right? So where I'm from is like this kind of community of people with their potlucks, with their, you know, going to churches, you know, like in the South, you know, on River Road, and going to like Black Baptist churches, and then going to like white Catholic churches, and sort of just seeing like that great mix of the way that people could be, and also the way that people creatively create community and space for community with one another, which was for me even just like going into, so I started school in 1981, I guess it was the year that I went to Walnut Hills Elementary as a kindergartner. That was the first year that schools were being integrated, like forced integration. And there was a tension that wasn't named to me, you know, as a 5-year-old at the time, but I could see it, you know, in the way that teachers moved, you know, and separated themselves from one another. And just like, you know, it was the first time that kids were sort of being bused. It was the court-ordered desegregation stuff was starting to happen here in Baton Rouge. And so I, you know, was like walking into this space that wasn't like what I was seeing in my home community in terms of like everybody sort of like wanting to create spaces of connection and community. That was what I was raised in my house and in the chosen community that my family was a part of. And so then it was interesting going to school and sort of walking into all of those tensions and seeing the way that those tensions manifest themselves in the world, and discovering my whiteness too, you know, and like confronting that and being like, oh, whoa, you know, we're not all together. Like, I got to go sit over here with these white folks. And that's not this is the way the world is organized. You know, I have a lot of really vivid memories of figuring that piece out. And that always giving me a sort of a feeling of outsiderness, you know, like I never really felt comfortable, you know, because I always felt like I was supposed to play along with these roles that just didn't mesh with my family's values, and also what felt normal and natural to me in my own home and in my own, you know, just in the way life was, because I grew up in that preschool that my mom had created and those community spaces. But, you know, looking back now, I can see how that outsiderness or that otherness was a really beautiful thing to feel, because, you know, I felt a tension with the world as it is. So that's where I'm from.
As I'm listening to you speak, I just see a lot of similarities between my own background and your background as well, despite the fact that we are a generation apart. I mean, Gen X, millennial, and it's just crazy to think that even with me speaking to someone who's a Gen Xer, that those feelings of being an outsider, being other, kind of having to navigate different spaces that you feel aren't the spaces that you want to be in, but it's all about playing roles and being a certain person that isn't true to yourself. That's something that I experienced growing up, probably 2 decades later as an elementary, middle, and high school student as well. And that was one of the reasons why I left Baton Rouge, because I felt like, okay, this is not my place. I feel like I don't belong here. So I went to New Orleans and I went to New England. I just left and I kind of, you know, wanted to leave Baton Rouge and find a place where I could just be myself and not have to witness the segregation and the racism and the systemic inequalities, and just the aversion to people who were different or people who were unique. Did you ever feel like you wanted to leave? And did you actually leave Baton Rouge? Or did you kind of stay in Baton Rouge and kind of find your way?
Well, yeah, you are so right, Jahi, that our stories are so similar in that way. I would say that by the time I was a teenager, my identity was built around the notion of leaving. If somebody had said to me when I was 17 years old, you're going to have to live in Baton Rouge for the rest of your life, I would have been like, you know, I'm going to go jump off the Mississippi River Bridge, you know, like it was not like my whole sense of self at that point was kind of fixated on the idea that there was a bigger world out there, and that the way that life is organized here in Baton Rouge was not going to hold me in, you know. And I felt like I needed to go somewhere where people understood the world differently. I didn't go to college right after high school. I went to Baton Rouge High and I graduated in 1993. And that was a very bold move to not go to college. I think I was one of 2 students to graduate in my class who didn't go to college or the military. There was no notion of gap year in the early 90s. But my feeling about it was that like school to me had become an exercise in frustration. You know, I just was like, you know, I was curious about things and school seemed to just get in the way of that rather than enable that. I was often like in classes reading other books than so there were certain subjects that I liked, but there was other subjects where I just was doing my own reading list and not paying any attention. So I kind of thought, well, why would I subject myself to more school? Let me just go live in the world and learn how to be independent and learn from the world. You know, that was what I was interested in doing. And also, you know, you can always go to the library and get some books. You don't need somebody to assign them to you, was the way that I felt about it, you know? So I was kind of fixated at age 17 on like just getting out. And I think I would have liked to have gone to a college that was elsewhere, but it wasn't really part of my experience or my family's experience to do that, you know? So, this was pre-internet really, you know, guidance counselors, like I just seemed like, you know, how some people like go on college tours, and that just wasn't part of my experience. Like, so like it was like, my family was like, go to LSU. And I was like, I don't want to go to LSU. And so therefore, just the other option was just don't go to college. You know what I'm saying? Like, I didn't know how to like work out another path for myself. So I ended up traveling around a bit. Like I saved some money and I just went on like this trip, you know, and visited other cities and people that I kind of knew in other places. And then I ended up going to Houston simply because I had a friend who had moved there. And he said that we could get an apartment together. And I just was like, okay, Houston's not Baton Rouge. That's all I need. And so that's where I lived in Houston for a number of years. I actually did start going to college when I was there. I went to the University of Houston for about a year. I saw my friends. I was like working at the Children's Museum at Smoothie King and doing things like that. And I saw my friends going to college and I was like, man, they look like they're having fun, like forget this minimum wage labor. I mean, I still had to do minimum wage labor to pay the bills, but I just was like, actually, I'm not as disciplined as I think I am. I actually probably do need someone to assign me some things to read and write. So let me go do this. But the commitment that I made to myself was that if I did it, I was taking classes because I cared about it, and I wasn't taking it because I was supposed to. So this was just like my promise to myself, is that I was going to make that education about my own journey and my own learning. So I went to University of Houston, and then a wonderful thing happened to me there in Houston, which was that I was working at the Children's Museum, and I was a tour guide for school tours that would come through. And of course, like there's a huge Latinx population, a huge Mexican, Chicano population in Houston. And so there would be these school tours that would come through where the students were all Spanish speaking. And I was so frustrated that I couldn't communicate with those students. And let me tell you, I was a terrible Spanish student, Spanish in high school. Like Spanish was one of the classes where I was just like reading my book, not paying attention. It just didn't seem relevant to me, in my like youthful ignorance, just didn't seem important. So there I was in Houston with these tours, and I was just like, I want to speak to these children, like it's so frustrating to me that I have to go through a translator. I want to be in community and communication with them. And that human feeling of wanting to talk to other people led me to begin to save money. I even moved back to Baton Rouge and went to LSU for a semester just so that I could live at home and save money. And I just saved all my money. I worked for the Big Buddy program and did like an after school program and stuff and saved so that I could go live in Mexico for a year. And I did an exchange program there through the Partnership for Service Learning. And I worked at a place called Casa Hogar, which was, I guess you could call it an orphanage. I mean, many of the young people that lived there did have contact with their families, but their families were not able to care for them. Many of their mothers like worked as domestics in rich people's homes, and they like lived in the maid's room and they couldn't keep their children with them, for example. And so this was something run by the Catholic Church, and it was a school where, kids that didn't, couldn't live with their families for different reasons or didn't, have families that could care for them, stayed there at Casa Hogar. And so there were 55 boys and 2 nuns. And the nuns who felt like such grown-ups to me were only really like a few years older than me. And I went to school in the morning and studied Spanish. And then in the afternoons, I went to Casa Hogar. And those boys taught me, basically really all the important things that I know about, that they taught me Spanish, of course, wonderful immersion program is to go hang out with a bunch of like 7-year-olds. And then you'll learn a language. I mean, it's like, I helped them with their homework and they were teaching me. They were like, be, say, I'm like repeating along. So that's really, I learned Spanish from these delightful children. And I also learned, I think, the most important things, that some of the deepest lessons that have carried me into my career working with young people and creating spaces where young people can be nurtured and be in community with one another. Because unlike the kind of like youth after school programs and stuff in the United States, where there's this sort of like everything is driven by like, what are your goals and objectives? What's your lesson plan? What are your outcomes? We're going to measure this, we're going to measure that. And it puts you in this position of being this kind of manager of other people, which is not, being a manager of other people is not a great way to become in community with other people, to be in beloved community with other people. And so what that experience afforded me was an opportunity to really be in deep, real relationship, because it was just open-ended. Like I just went and hung out, and the young people there needed nurturance, and they needed an adult who would, basically mother in some ways, and just be in a community of care. And so I learned how to be in community, in solidarity with them, by just showing up. I didn't have a lot to offer. I mean, I didn't even speak the language, you know what I'm saying? Like they had to take care of me. really. And then little by little, you know, I learned how to be in a respectful relationship and community with them. So that year was really important to my development. Learned another language, all that kind of stuff. Then I came home. I really loved the service piece, you know, and so for some reason, I had Chicago on my mind. I was really getting into reading poetry, like Black arts poetry. And Gwendolyn Brooks was a poet who I just had fallen in love with. She was still alive at this time in Chicago. So I just was like, I want to go to Chicago. So I applied for a Vista position there, working in Uptown at a place called Neon Street, which was a shelter for homeless youth. And I was able to move to Chicago through that. Took another year off college to do that. And then I ended up staying in Chicago for like 10 years and getting really involved in youth spoken word poetry at Neon Street. That's where I started a poetry workshop that then led to a lot of other work that I did there. That was my sort of journey out, you know, into the world. There were some other excursions as well, like the time when I went and spent a summer in Cuba and then ended up marrying a Cuban man.
It just seems like your journey was more so kind of like what you would see in a movie, where it's like the character discovers something and then suddenly their life changes. Then they discover something else and their life changes. It's just so interesting and ironic because you now have a PhD, but you're talking about how at one point in your life, college wasn't exactly something that you immediately wanted to do. Like life is very crazy. Like you never know where you're gonna go or where you're gonna end up.
Yeah, no, I was never really that inclined towards like scholastic things or schooly kind of things. Like that was not who, I mean, if you had told me that I was going to get a PhD, I would have been like, please, you know, like why, you know, like that's certainly, I just had never imagined such a thing, you know, that was all, it was an unfolding, you know, and I think you're right. Like it in terms of it not being seeming linear, but not linear because the seeds were planted early for things that I later was attracted to or pulled to. And I didn't know that certain life was possible for myself. I grew up in a household where reading was fundamental, you know, like we were brought to the library, you know, once every week or two, and we each checked out, my brothers and I, you know, 2 grocery bags full of library books, and we were not allowed to watch a lot of television, and we just read a lot, you know. So I grew up in a very like literature infused kind of household, and I've always loved language and the written word, and I've always just loved it. And when I was in high school, I started to hear, and I'm sure you can relate to this as a poet, I started to hear the voice inside your mind that is composing. And it just felt like this urgency to write things down. But I didn't have any community around me that nurtured that kind of voice, that listened for that. And I felt really self-conscious about it. I was like, I don't know what this is. You know, I thought, well, maybe like I'll die one day and sort of like Emily Dickinson, they'll just like find my notebooks. And, you know, there was no place where people said to me, like, it's okay to just explore your voice as a writer. I thought writers had to like pop out of the womb like fully formed or something, you know? And so I was doing this writerly stuff, but I was really scared of it because I felt like it was too presumptuous to call myself a writer, and I didn't have any mentorship that was developing me in that way. And so what was interesting for me is that when I started working with young people, I started to what you know, they were like, well, what can you do, Anna? You know, and I was like, well, you know, I know stuff about poetry because I like it, you know, because I read it. And so I started to read poetry with young people. And I was working, this was that summer right before I was getting ready to go to Mexico. I was working for the Boys and Girls Club and Big Buddy here in Baton Rouge, like doing like a summer program. And so I put together these poetry books where we would do these choral readings of the poetry. And so we were reading like Amiri Baraka, and we were, you know, I was into like the Black arts movement poetry. And so it was like really fun to have a bunch of 4th and 5th and 6th graders like sort of chanting this poetry together. And that being in community with one another and hearing the beauty of the written word. I had never been to an open mic. I'd never been to a poetry slam. So I first experienced that like as a youth worker, you know, like these spaces where we could create spaces where we can just like love language together and be in language with one another. then later on, when I moved to Chicago, I encountered this literary community. I mean, that's what really drew me there. I was drawn to that, and it really was there. There was this literary community. There were open mics, there were slams, there was people who wrote poetry. And it never had occurred to me that you could both be a writer and be in this literary work and also be somebody that did community work. To me, those felt like separate paths because I've never seen the ways that they could intersect with one another. And because of the family that I came from and the values that I was raised with, I kind of thought, well, you have to do like meaningful work in the world, and like just going and like, so I wanted to study poetry or writing or whatever, but that just felt so selfish. I was just like, what, like I felt self-conscious about that. And so it was really when I started the poetry, well, I didn't start it. Actually, someone else had started the poetry program at the shelter years before me. And I read about it in a file cabinet. And I said, you can do this. You can have a poetry workshop where you write poetry, with young people in a shelter for homeless youth. And so I didn't know that that was a thing that could be done. So then we started to do that there. And I tapped into some other teaching artists who kind of like showed me the basic ropes. And that was another school for me, so that was more important than anything I learned in college. Like learning how to be in community, how to design a writing workshop, and also just what it did for people. Because these were young people who were, many of them homeless. It was a daytime shelter. We weren't even providing like, shelter for them at night. It was a place where they could come and get services. And the director even said to me at one point when I asked about starting the program, he was like, well, these kids need jobs, they need housing, they need counseling, they need these kind of things that are really tangible. And I was like, I get that, I'm not against them having that, obviously, but I think that there's something else here that the human spirit needs, right? Which is a space to come together and not necessarily like, it's not coming together like in a therapeutic setting where we say, okay, we're going to talk about how we've suffered, but it's coming together based on our skills and our love of language and our ability to spit and to make something beautiful out of what we've experienced. And that was so healing for the young people there, and it was healing for me. And that was my first writing community that I ever belonged to. And I was only like 22 years old, maybe 21, 22 years old. So I was just figuring that out with them. And then that led me to get really invested in writing pedagogies and creating spaces for writing. And I connected with an organization called Young Chicago Authors. And, really myself and some other teaching artists really kind of moved into Young Chicago Authors, and we made it into a much bigger organization and started Louder Than a Bomb, which is the largest youth poetry slam in the country now. And, it's a huge festival. It's a big deal. Documentary film, go check it out. So we were just, it was like, there was a moment, and we were organizing. So like, I kind of drew on the knowledges that I had from watching adults when I was a young person build community and build spaces of community. But I brought the love that I had inside of me for language and for writing, and saw that like writing community was one of the most beautiful and brilliant ways to build that community.
Based on what I am seeing, kind of hearing, it feels like the organicness almost was structured, because as one path opened, the path, you follow the path and discovered so much and discovered what you can do in the world. And it's just amazing that you were able to find a way to give back to young people and to impact young people in a way that you probably never envisioned when you were in their shoes, many, many years ago. You've gone to Houston, and that inspired you to kind of learn Spanish and figure out more ways to engage with young people. Then you were in Mexico, where you saw intentionally how young people can help adults and how those relationships can be collaborative. And then you went to Chicago, and you played a role in, helping to create a literary scene there and a poetry scene there. But one of the things that I have observed about Baton Rougians who leave and kind of see the world and come back is that they have to come back. And sometimes it's for reasons that are triumphant, like, oh, I've done everything. I'm kind of over living thousands of miles away from home. I'm going to retire. And then sometimes it comes because we either feel lost and we want to find our way back. The finances kind of become an issue. Or maybe, something happens and we realize that, we just need to be back home. And everything doesn't, and the whole journey doesn't work out for us. So how did you end up back in Baton Rouge after having lived in Chicago and created such a culture and community there?
It was multi-layered in why I came back. On one hand, things have really begun to grow and take off at Young Chicago Authors in a big way. And I was the director of that organization. I mean, there was an executive director, Bob Boone, who, was really retired and kind of kept in name, was the executive director and came and met with us once a week. But I was really running the organization. And I was 29 years old at the time, that I left. And so I was about to turn 30, and I was a new mom. I was newly married. I was running a nonprofit organization, which Jahi, you and I both know, that ain't no, that's not an easy feat. In some ways, everything was really taking off in these beautiful ways, but I did not know yet. I had not yet learned the art of how to take care of myself. And I was running myself into the ground, working all the time, just 7 days a week. I was passionate about what I was doing. And I think that people recognized that I was passionate and they looked to me for leadership, but I wasn't really ready to do that. I needed more mentorship. I needed to be slowed down, and I definitely had friends and advisors around me who were like, Anna, you gotta slow this down. And then I had a young child, Anton, when we moved back to Baton Rouge, was 3 years old. And I had a marriage that was on some rocky ground. Like my son's father, Leo, had come from, he was from Havana. We met when I lived there one summer at the end of college. And then, well, actually we met when I lived there one summer at the end of college, and then I went back for a writer's conference and met him there. He's a writer from Havana, and, came to the United States to do some literary type stuff. And then, we decided to get married so that he could stay. And, we were in love and wanted to make that work, but that's a lot of pressure. I mean, he didn't speak English. His entry into the country, that experience of immigration is a trauma, I mean, it's a really traumatic experience. And to experience that at the young age that we were, with a small child, running a nonprofit organization, like I didn't have the resources to sustain all of that, at once. And Leo and I now, we like have a brother-sister sort of relationship. I mean, we love each other very much. And we look back at that time and we realized like what a hard time it was, because of, that transition was just so stressful. And we were just learning so much. So it became more and more appealing to come back to Baton Rouge, where I had family, where I had a support system. And so in 2005, we moved down here, and I'd always been in relationship with the Big Buddy program, because, my mother had been instrumental in building that organization, and Galen Mack was somebody that I'd known since my childhood. And so I said to her, I said, what if I came down to Baton Rouge and started something like what I do at Young Chicago Authors in Baton Rouge in 2005. And so she, being gay, was like, absolutely, let's make space for this, let's clear space. And I got like one grant, which was just enough to pay like half a year's salary for me. And so I just moved down to start that up. And that was 2005. So I moved down maybe 2 weeks before Hurricane Katrina, dropped my stuff off. And then Leo and Anton and I went to Havana to go visit his family. And we were gone for a couple of weeks, and that's when Katrina hit. And so we came back to Baton Rouge after that trip, and everything was changed, right? So like everything was permanently changed here in this community. I mean, that's sort of upheaval. So that was the conditions in which wordplay, which later became Forward Arts, was first created. It was, this whole community was in this upheaval. And so in some ways, what a perfect time to be starting a youth poetry program. So I went to schools and I did poetry workshops with young people, so that's what I was doing. It was just me initially, and worked with teachers, and I partnered with teachers. So Destiny Cooper was one of the teachers who I partnered with, which you can now see how the seeds of Humanities Amped, right, were in that. So we met each other in 2005. She was a teacher at Northdale, and I was a teaching artist that came and did poetry workshops in her classroom. And I knew these young poets in New Orleans who I had met through the National Youth Poetry Slam. So I invited them to come to Baton Rouge to do sort of a tour through the schools and show other young people here in Baton Rouge what it looked like when young people did this spoken word poetry at a high level. And you could just see all the light bulbs going off because they were doing things that I could never do as this like 30-year-old white woman, you know, coming in. Like I couldn't model for them what it was like to have like a peer community of writers. And so when they saw those young people from New Orleans doing their piece, it was like you could feel the fire just. And shortly after that, we started Fresh Heat, the teen open mic that, you know, was at that time once a month. And we had like 250 kids at the first Fresh Heat. So it was crazy. It was freaking nuts. Yeah. And then we started Word Crew, which is, you know, what you were a part of, Jahi, you know, years later. So Word Crew was like this group of young people from the different schools. They could come from any school who were really interested in being writers and cultivating their craft as writers, coming together once a week to write and then to put on and produce Fresh Heat as a, you know, in the sort of youth core that put that on. And we had 30 young people in Word Crew. It was a very strong, like, you know, start because I think there was such a need and that tour had been so effective. And so then we were quickly in a place where we could bring Zero on board. Chancellor Zero Skidmore came on and he and I were the only two working together. And then Latasha Weatherspoon, the incredible Latasha Weatherspoon joined us, and Anna Hirsch and Donnie Rose, and eventually Desiree Della Giacomo. And, you know, so we just started to build you know, an organization and a community at Big Buddy. And that's, you know, what happened here in Baton Rouge. So when I moved home, it was to recover in some ways. And I threw my passion and I threw a lot of energy into building wordplay. It was almost like I just took all the energy of the sorrow of like Leo and I split up, the divorce, the having to leave Chicago, which I really didn't want to leave, but I kind of needed to leave to survive. And coming back to Baton Rouge felt really like, at first I was not happy about that. It felt like a failure to me, like the 30-year-old self could feel the judgment of the 17-year-old self looking at me and being like, oh, you see, you couldn't make it out there. That's why you had to move back to Baton Rouge, you know? And so I just threw myself into that work and, you know, was building something here with this community that we were all really proud of. And then I started to feel kind of burnout. Like I was starting to feel like, what am I doing? I don't know what I'm doing. I don't know why I'm living in Baton Rouge, really. You know, my family's here, but is this where I want to be? I thought I wanted another life. So I decided to step back and go to graduate school. And I had a plan to apply to like 10 different graduate schools or whatever, you know. And I applied to a program at Harvard because there's this arts and ed program, which felt like a long shot, you know, to go to Harvard. Like it just felt like not something that I would be eligible for. And then I lost interest. Then I sort of lost steam, and I didn't apply to any other programs. Like, I had this plan. I was going to go to graduate school. They had the first deadline, so I applied to them. And then I was like, you know what? Forget about it. I'm good. What it was that I met my current partner, Victor, and fell in love, and we were all happy. And I was just like too happy to apply to graduate school. And then I got accepted to Harvard. And then I was like, wow, I got accepted to Harvard. I guess I have to go. I mean, you don't not go if you get accepted to Harvard, right? But Anton was in the 3rd grade and I was a single mom, you know. I mean, I just had this like new partner, but I was really a single mom. And I was like, how am I going to survive? How am I going to go to Harvard? It's a 1-year intensive program. Like, and so I decided to go, and my friend Amanda, who was one of my students in Chicago, or, you know, one of the young people at YCA and who I was really, really close with, she moved to Boston with me and lived with me and helped, you know, and just, you know, then I had a community there, right? So I had like a comadre, somebody to help me be a mama, because I was really scared to do it by myself. But it was such a wonderful year. I was so blessed. You know, I think Anton loved it up there. He had a great time. He got to see another perspective and see things as if they could be otherwise. And I got a chance to read and write and think and ask questions that, you know, nonprofit work doesn't give you the space and time. And you're just so busy, you know, figuring out how you're going to pay for, you know, get the salaries together, get the programs together. And I had increasingly moved into like administrative roles because somebody's got to do it. You know, I like the program work. I love the program work, but somebody's got to do the damn administrative work. And so I was like, well, you know, it's not like whatever that model is where people think like the administrators are like all happy and relaxed, you know, or whatever, or sitting on top of the the resources, it's like, no, actually in a nonprofit organization, administrators are people who are just like willing to get the hard work done sometimes. And that's kind of who I was, but I needed a break. And when I went to Harvard, I realized that I wanted a lot more of that. Like I wanted space to read and reflect and think. And so I was like, well, I'm just get a PhD because then I can just hang out here. It was almost like a second youth for me. Yeah. And then I came back to Baton Rouge. I realized when I was at Harvard, for some reason, I began to realize that I loved Baton Rouge. And that this is this place that like everyone leaves, and that maybe that we could reframe it if we just wanted to. You know, I found myself telling stories of like how proud I was of the community here. I realized like how much wealth there was in our experiences and our way of being together. I just could appreciate it in a way that I just couldn't appreciate it before. I missed it, and I was like, why would I give that all away to go live in some random other place just because the world says that place is more important, you know? And you know this, Jahi, like being from a place like Baton Rouge, you go out there into the world, and I know you know this. People, you go to a party and people say, I want you to meet my friend Jahi. He's from where? Not Baton Rouge, New Orleans, right? You know what I'm talking about? Like the invisibility.
I was just really just listening and thinking, oh my God, I literally had the same exact thought when I was in grad school. I'm not sure what the timeline was like, but I was in grad school in the mid 2010s. And so like I was in Vermont going to grad school, and I found myself being more passionate about being from Louisiana than I had in any part of my life, because being in New England was so different from me. It's like going from a diverse place. I mean, Louisiana is no United Nations, but it is a diverse, multicultural place. And then going to Vermont, which is almost exclusively white. And then just kind of talking to people about Baton Rouge and Louisiana and New Orleans, because I had moved from New Orleans straight to New England to grad school after I finished at UNO. And I was like, wow, Baton Rouge is a very important part of me. I was talking to people about Forward Arts and Word Crew and going to McKinley and all these different things. At the moment that I was deciding to go back home and possibly do an internship, it was either stay on the East Coast, go to the West Coast, and home was never an option for me. And then I remember coming back home in the winter and having this epiphany of, wait a minute, everybody leaves Baton Rouge.
Mm-hmm.
And the reason why Baton Rouge is the way that it is because everybody who leaves never comes back. People need to come back and bring that energy from other places into Baton Rouge to show people an alternate reality. I can talk about that journey of coming back home, starting 821, but this is not about me, this is about you. But in many ways, there's so many intersections because I felt the exact same way about just that whole journey. And what's interesting about it is that when I'm hearing you speak, there are so many intersections. The obvious one is Word Crew. I mean, I was in Word Crew with Zero and Donnie and Desiree Della Giacomo. But at the same time, when I came back home, I had to start from scratch, and I had to kind of revisit the old relationships that I had, which were my relationships with Word Crew and Forward Arts, but it was also, surprisingly enough, the relationships I had with McKinley. Because when I started 821, that was when I had actually gotten to know you, because I had known of you, but actually gotten to know you, and to also know Miss Cooper. I don't call her Destiny, but she was to me, Miss Cooper, being at McKinley, and the work that you all were doing with Humanities Amped. But I also know that Humanities Amped had been in existence for several years before I had kind of returned back home from grad school. Tell me how that journey was to starting Humanities Amped and kind of what Humanities Amped looks like now.
Yeah, well, Destiny, aka Miss Cooper, and I had been friends and collaborators for many years, you know, through the work of Wordplay, then Forward Arts. But we'd always had these kind of peripheral conversations, these side conversations where we thought like, we were just thinking a lot about this question of like, why are schools so impenetrable in some ways, you know, like how do we rethink what a classroom is to think about it as a space that is more porous and open to the community, as a site of collective learning, and then that is more transformational than closing the school door or closing the classroom door and like there's a teacher and there are 30 students or 25 students or whatever, and they're just in this isolated space. Like, why can't a classroom be a little bit more of a space where community is coming in and out, and students are going out into the community, and communities coming into the classroom, and people are asking real world questions and learning through their own inquiry, right? And their own questions. And in some ways it starts with that writing pedagogy. Because what we do when we do these poetry pieces is that we write from where we are, as Gwendolyn Brooks always said, you tell the story that's in front of your nose, like that's what's going to make your writing great, is that you write from your own experience. And so this honoring of our own experiences and the questions that are inside of our own experiences was something that Destiny and I were really interested in as teachers, this really culturally relevant and sustaining pedagogies, this, how do we shape curriculum and learning like around students' own lives and their own worlds? And we knew that poetry pedagogies were one way to do that, and a really successful way to do that. But we were sort of like, well, can we do more with that? Can we extend that in other ways? And so she and I were both in graduate school at the same time. I was just at that point of a PhD program where I had to start thinking about what my dissertation project would be. And which is this incredible opportunity. I really think you should do it someday, Jahi, actually, because it's a really pretty cool opportunity. You can do that PhD thing and think of it as like, well, I just have to get this done. I just have to complete this so that I can get this degree. But what I figured out, like basically when I did my undergrad, you remember when I said I made a promise to myself that I was going to do it for myself? That was a really huge choice that I made that didn't shape so much else in my life. I just kept making that promise to myself. I'm going to do things that I care about. And I'm going to put that at the center, and then I'm going to let the other things fall in place behind it. You know what I'm saying? Like, I'm not going to do a PhD to get a PhD. I'm going to do a PhD because I'm curious and I want to learn things. And then the PhD becomes the result, right, of that, and not the other way around. So that opportunity to like frame a dissertation project created this moment. And Destiny was getting her master's at the time. She was at LSU getting her master's. So we actually had time to do something like go to lunch, which we don't normally have time to do. Let's be honest. You know what I'm saying? Because we're just busy all the time. And we just have these like sort of little conversations. We could do this, we could do that. So we had time to like actually think about it. And it was very organic. We went to lunch one day and we were just like both talking about how terrified we were about returning to the classroom as a classroom teacher, me to nonprofit administrative work, most likely, doing youth. And we were like, it's a burnout situation. It's a setup for failure. And suddenly we were like, what would happen if we joined forces? What if we thought about how we can create something that its mission is within public schools themselves? Because we both are big believers in public education. We can see what's happening with the privatization of public education, through the charter movement and the ways that public schools are being undermined in this current era of quote unquote school reform. And in some ways, like nonprofits just collaborate with that, right? Because what a nonprofit does is it goes out and seeks funds, oftentimes money that is, from corporations, to do work that is really about the public good. So we were interested in like, how could we do work that is about the public good within the public system, and help to kind of shift some of the issues within the public system while we're doing it, like just by partnering with one another. And so that was and Humanities Amped started off very small. It was English Amped at first. It was just the two of us, and we had one class of about 27 students, and at McKinley High School. And the administration there was very open to us creating a class that could be 2 class periods long, because we were like, we want to do project-based learning that involves community, and you can't do that in 55 minutes a day. We need 2 class periods. So we married creative writing and English to one another as one longer class. And so we had the students 6th period and 7th period. And everybody that came into it knew that we were in this big experiment together. The parents, we had family meetings and met the young people, and we were like, we don't know what's going to happen. We're just going to unfold and we're going to learn together. We had some ideas, and so it was this big journey. Because we couldn't create it without being collaborative with the people who would be at the center of it, right? And so that first year, we began to develop some of the methodologies that are now part of Humanities Amped, this larger project, and now we work with over about 500 young people at 5 schools. And we partner with 15 teachers, and we bring community educators, into those classrooms to partner with those teachers. So what you saw between Destiny and I is sort of like the original of that model. She was a classroom educator. I was a community educator. I had a lot of knowledge about sort of youth development work and sort of how to build a community where people feel connected to one another, that's humanized. And that's part of the humanities in Humanities Amped. And she really knows inside. I mean, Destiny's an incredible educator, as you know. she knows how to teach. Man, she teach. She is a teacher and a teacher of teachers. And so we sort of melded our knowledges together, and we worked with the young people and their families and various community volunteers to define what would become Humanities Amped. So a space where we center young people and their well-being and their connectedness. And so we learned how to do circle processes. We learned about restorative justice. We learned all of this kind of like as we went along. So it's been a learning journey. We learned how to do what's critical participatory action research, which is the big word for just saying, like, inviting young people to ask real questions about their life experiences and to frame those as research and action projects. So we little by little learned how to do this, and little by little we began to expand the program. So because young people told us, they said, we don't want to go back to our regular English class now, we want to stay together. And so we created a cohort model at McKinley, and we were just at McKinley for 5 years building that. Alex Torres came along and built the English Learners Program, which is so freaking brilliant. We got LSU to kind of connect to us with graduate students. And so just little by little, we just began to build this thing, just to breathe some more life into classrooms. And teachers feel so isolated. When teachers have a deep community that's meaningful, that's not just about the numbers and the data games, but is about like deep learning and human connection at the heart of it, then everybody comes alive. So our mission is not just about youth, it's also about educators. It's about educators being able to be returned to their deeper purposes for doing this work. And we have this, learning community amongst educators. And now we have youth who are part of the learning community. We have apprentice leaders, and they're part of the learning community with their educators and plan classes with their teachers, because, we really believe students can be teachers and teachers can be students, and we have to be. Learning is a lifelong thing, And so that's what Humanities Amped is doing. And we're just kind of seeding those possibilities in classrooms all over the place. And poetry is a huge part of it. As you know, Forward Arts became a part of Humanities Amped last year. And so Desiree works with us now. Donnie just got a position with Sean King's newspaper, the North Star. And so he's no longer working with us at Humanities Amped, but he's on our board and totally part of the community. And so, we continue to do. The poetry work is a major pedagogy. It's a way that we get into the knowledge that we have, the experience.
You find yourself possibly light years away from the moment that you graduated high school and were like, I am never coming back to Baton Rouge. I don't want to be here. I just want to get out. And now you are deeply rooted in this community and helping young people to feel as though they can make a difference and that they're feeling heard. At the same time, though, you are a Gen Xer who had the feeling of Baton Rouge is not my place. Baton Rouge is not my place. I'm a millennial who's like, I'm Baton Rouge. At one point was like, Baton Rouge is not my place. Baton Rouge is not my place. Quite frankly, I have a lot of moments where I still feel like it's not my place. And then we have people younger than me who are saying the exact same thing. So I feel as though there is a generational issue in terms of how people feel a sense of connectedness to their community. What do you feel needs to happen to make Baton Rouge a place where younger people feel as though this is a place that they can belong in? Because oftentimes I hear people cynically critique people who leave Baton Rouge as like, oh, you feel like this place isn't good enough for you, or why would you leave? There's plenty of opportunity here, but there's no actual effort being made to make it to where young people feel as though this is a place they can invest in and be a part of. So what do you feel like needs to happen to reverse the trend and break the cycle?
As you're saying that, Jackie, too, I'm just thinking to myself, like, that's the main thing. I mean, Like if we can change that about Baton Rouge, then we can change everything about Baton Rouge. You know, if we can change the way that young people feel about this city and about their sense of possibility and power here, then we can transform the whole city. I mean, you know, I know that sounds like really idealistic, but I think that there's some magic in that. So how do we do that? Well, first of all, I want to just say that I think part of the sort of phenomenon that those of us who are from Baton Rouge of multiple generations understand is that we live in a world that like puts value on centers, places that seem like the center, right? And not on what we see as the periphery, you know? And of course, Baton Rouge is a large city, you know? It's not a small city, you know, but in some ways, I think we have this kind of inferiority complex next to our neighbor New Orleans, you know, which, you know, who is, you know, New Orleans is such a famous, you know, city and so loved, you know, the world over. Then it's just like, well, who's got any leftover? Baton Rouge, just from that perspective, just looks like a bunch of strip malls, you know, and it just looks like a bunch of suburban sprawl. It doesn't have the same sort of like charm in some ways, you know, when we think about what we want out of cities. And so my shifting on that, like similar to your own, which happened when I was away, was about realizing that, you know, people's lives matter here tremendously, you know, that people's lives matter everywhere, you know, and like this ways that we place more value on lives in particular places is just repeating the pattern of violence of like sort of saying like, you know, well, you know, American lives matter more than lives, you know, in Syria, for example, you know, that way of thinking about the world is that some people's lives matter more than other people's lives. And we invest value into spaces in this way. And that human beings have created those hierarchies and we can shift that, you know, we can change that. And so part of my thinking is about saying like, you know, this space is valuable and we need to love it and we need to see it for what it is, and, you know, and be honest about it, but we need to like also invest the value and the love, you know, in people that are here, because there's beautiful, brilliant people here in Baton Rouge. And so it kind of starts with that. I think it just starts with like claiming our own value and not like letting this like larger master narratives of like these spaces matter more than these spaces matter, you know. And so whenever somebody introduces me as Anna from New Orleans, you know, I got a chip on my shoulder about it. I love New Orleans. I love my people in New Orleans. But I'm like, yo, Baton Rouge is real. We exist. There's like, you know, 200,000 people here or whatever, you know? Like, so wait, how many people are here? Holy shit. I just completely messed that up.
It's like 220,000, 230,000.
Okay, not too bad then. I'm sorry. Yeah. So, you know, so I think that begins with that of being like worthy of investment, of like seeing ourselves as worthy of and valuable here. And then I think for young people, when I grew up, there was nothing to do when you were a teenager. There was things to do when you were like an elementary school kid. You know, there was places to go. There was Breck things. There was Big Buddy things. There was, you know, the roller rink. This is a good city to be a kid. You know, you have parks, you have outdoor spaces, you have yards, great space to be a young child. When you become an adolescent in Baton Rouge, where is there to go? What is there to do? What are the opportunities for adolescents in particular? And I think this is why I'm so passionate about adolescent development, because Baton Rouge didn't nurture me at that time. There wasn't a space for it. You know, that's why I was the secret poet, just putting the poems under the bed. I didn't have anywhere to bring them, you know? And so I think what we have to do, and Baton Rouge has gotten better in this way, but we have to continue to invest in spaces for young people to come and be connected and be in community with one another. We need to make a much larger investment in that in this city. You know, there are other cities where you know, we have the Mayor's Youth Workforce Program in the summertime. There are other cities where that's year round, you know. There are cities where the city government has, you know, put a percentage of their budget towards youth programming and recognizes that if we want to, you know, shift the outcomes for the city as a whole, we need to shift outcomes for young people so that they feel hopeful, so that they feel connected. Here in Louisiana, we have like one of the highest rates of youth disconnectedness in the country. I think the highest rate of youth disconnectedness in the country, meaning that there's the highest rate of young people who are neither in school nor working just disconnected, and then, we wonder why we're also the prison capital of the world. As a state, we've taken more, our approach has been more about like punishment and control and management than it has been about development and connection. And so if we shifted and we put our resources into youth community centers, opportunities for young people, jobs for young people, and I'm not talking about working at McDonald's jobs, I'm talking about creative jobs where they could tap into their talents, into their ability to transform themselves and the world at the same time, then I think that people would be invested in this space. I mean, we have to redefine it, but we have to invest in that.
Investing in the people also means to see the beauty in ourselves, because I think one of the things that I struggled with as a young person growing up in Baton Rouge was this idea that I had all this cosmopolitan conscious energy that I couldn't use. I didn't know that organizations like, Atlas Foundation existed. I didn't know they were doing cooking classes, because when I was at the age that I was young, there was an organization where I could learn about the world or learn about social issues and meet people and not feel like I can't really meet people because everybody else knows each other but me. Forward Arts was my place for me. It was the closest I could come to a place where I could find the sense of belonging and connectedness. But I'm a multi-layered person. Not only do I write, but at the time that I was doing Word Crew, I was also a people-to-people ambassador. And I was traveling and I was into international affairs. There was nothing that I could do in Baton Rouge for understanding other cultures and international affairs and those kind of things as well. And even though I was able to still do that in Louisiana by going to UNO, I had to leave Louisiana altogether just to have a space where people were thinking about the world and a community that wasn't just them. And that's why 821 existed, to give people an idea to think about the world outside of their community, but not to the idea that we're thinking that Baton Rouge is beneath the world. We are a part of the world. We need to embrace that. So I feel like what you're saying is I resonate very strongly with. When you invest in young people, all the other issues we struggle with kind of go away on their own, because young people who are more connected reduces the prison population. It helps with criminal justice reform. I'm thinking about, in terms of economic justice, you have more young people empowered to be able to have careers and jobs and give to a community, which will increase revenue in terms of the people that are investing economically in their communities. And also, when you have strong, resilient communities, that attracts businesses to come, because they're like, okay, wow, Baton Rouge is doing something. Like, people are coming here. People see this place as a place to invest in. Maybe we need to put a business here, put a company in. And of course, that has to be socially conscious, because there are cases in which people come to a community and only the people who are in non-marginalized positions get those jobs or get those opportunities. But if those things work in tandem, you'll see a Baton Rouge that is rich and vibrant, and not because we are trying to make it into LA or Chicago or Atlanta or Houston, but because we're seeing the beauty within ourselves and embracing that.
Absolutely. There's no replacement for it. And what do we really need to, what do young people really need to be able to experience, right? In order to create that community that we want to live in, they need to experience a lot of what you experienced, which was that, spaces where we can experience our own power and the power of our own voices, like that has to happen, because otherwise we're just doing this thing where we're sort of passively accepting what's given to us, as opposed to shaping what we could create, so there has to be a sense of power. There has to be a sense of creativity. There has to be a sense of collectivity and working togetherness, like if we can foster the imaginary that's possible. And I don't mean imaginary as in it's not real, but I mean, in other words, to make it real, we have to first imagine it. When I was a young person, I couldn't even imagine some of those things because I had never seen them before. I had never experienced them. And so when young people step into, this is what we try to do in Humanities Amped, is we try to give people a performance of possibility. So in this classroom, you're going to experience that you are in community where we care about each other, student to student, teacher to student, everybody cares about everyone, and our lives are all valuable and they all matter. And if anyone is struggling, then we are all going to create space to hold that, And so if you've never experienced that before, you don't know that that's possible. You don't know that the world can be like that. You have to have that experience. And so if that experience is just what happens in your second hour class in your 10th grade year, and you experience that, then you know it's possible. And not only is it possible, but you were part of creating it, right? So it's not something that you passively received, but it's something that you co-created, you know? And this is why we're really into democratic processes, and we're into young people's voices and their engagement, because young people have to experience themselves as people who can generate such spaces, who can create such things, because then they have the power to go out and continue to build it, you know? And so this like apprentice leaders program that we have right now, where we've got 20 young people who are now paid part of our staff, you know, who are helping to literally plan classrooms and attend professional learning communities with their teachers and stuff like that. Like they're 16 and 17 years old and 15 years old and middle schoolers even, you know, and they have knowledge and wisdom and can contribute and can shape a space and can make sense of the world, right? And so we want to create structures that help young people to recognize their own power and then build up the skills that they need. You know, I think we were trained in this model of education that says, first you have to get all the skills, then you can have some freedom to create something, you know? But like, think about like you spoken word poetry and the way it turns all that on its head. It says, everybody is a poet. Anybody is a poet. You can put a couple words together, you're a poet. We're not interested in this classical model of you have to have all this training to be a poet. This capacity for language has been given to all of us. It is a gift given to all of us. It does not just belong to a few people. Get your gatekeepers and go sit down. Like we think that everybody can participate. And what is a democratic country doing if we are not educating young people so that they know that they can participate, you know, in the process of creating their communities and creating their worlds? Is our education system as it's currently set up doing that? It's really, in some small instances it is, but mostly it's not. And especially if you want to look at the difference between, you know, sort of traditional public schools that serve mostly working class Black and immigrant students, those students are being taught to obey, to capitulate, you know what I'm saying, to pass a standardized test. Whereas if you go to Episcopal or you go to Baton Rouge High, you go to magnet schools, you know, some people are being trained to be managers and some people are being trained to basically take orders, you know. And I'm not saying that to insult the very dedicated educators, parents, or, you know, and loving administrators and all the people that work so hard every day and really give all of their lives in urban schools to make that situation otherwise. But we have to really rethink the premise from the ground up and think about how we can put creativity and collaboration at the center of the curriculum so that young people get experiences to think independently and flexibly and not just to master some content knowledge, you know, and then regurgitate it on a test. Those are not the skills that we actually need to build a vibrant community or build a better world. They're not the skills that are going to get anybody past a minimum wage job, to be honest, you know. You got to be able to think flexibly and creatively, you know, and so we have to rethink school to do all of that. And that's kind of part of the project of Humanities Amped.
You all are doing amazing work, and I feel as though Humanities Amped is a very happy marriage between the quantitative and the qualitative, meaning the people who are looking for numbers, who just want to see whether or not people can do good on the test and go to college and get a good degree. You all have that. And then you also have the qualitative, which is making people and young people feel empowered, having a more stronger community as it relates to teacher-student relationships, and also just creating a framework which I hope will expand beyond EBR and maybe into the South and even into America, this idea of youth participatory education and teacher-student relationships that are very much Freirean in terms of like Paulo Freire and that whole teachers can be students and students can be teachers. You have done a lot, like a lot. And whether it was just in your life as a young woman to now, I just want to know, you know, what is next for you? What do you want to accomplish with Humanities Amped, and also for yourself? You know, who would you like to work with, or what are some things that you'd like to do that you have not yet done before, if resources and capital were unlimited to you?
Ooh, good question. Ay, ay, ay. Well, let's see. So I think that for Humanities Amped, we want to transform our school system, from within, right? And we want to do it with the partnership of our school system. And we do have an incredible partnership with our school system that has invested in us. And so we want to, we believe that our theory of change is rhizomatic. It's like the rhizome, the root system that doesn't grow. It's not top down, it's actually lateral, so as we gain knowledge and experience, then we grow out, and we get wider and we get deeper, as we can add more and more people, to the network of what we're doing. And we have to have transformative experiences for ourselves in order to transform systems and structures. We are very influenced by Grace Lee Boggs, the activist in Detroit and organizer in Detroit, who really talks about that idea that was part of the civil rights movement of, transform yourself, transform the world, that those things are connected. So I don't have a grand vision for Humanities Amped, except that I hope that we can continue to thrive in a way where this root system grows wider and deeper, you know what I mean? Until it just becomes everything, you know what I mean? Like our system, our plan is not to become some giant gleaming nonprofit on a hill. Like, you know what I'm saying? If we really literally want to be grassroots, we want to be a grassroots organization that is just deeply doing the work with people. That being said, I'm on a journey right now of like learning how to be, a nonprofit executive director. This is my second year in it's completely fully in this role, doing the fundraising and things like that. So I feel like I'm just kind of getting more comfortable with the flow and the rhythm of those pieces and learning how to do that. So I don't want to stay here forever, like in this kind of a role, because I'm really an administrator right now. And, I feel like there's other people who are probably way more talented than me at this kind of thing. Like I like to work with programming. I like to work with young people. I like to work with educators. And ultimately, I also want to write some, Jahi. I have neglected that part of, my spirit in some ways, because my creative work is the work in the world. But I also would love to, for myself personally, and also for the work, I think it's really important to theorize the work that we're doing. I think it's important to think about the why it works, or what works and how does it work and what's happening. And I think that work, which can so often just be trapped up in the ivory tower of academia, I believe that work has to happen, from the grassroots as well. And so I'm interested in partnering with people to do various writing projects, to document, and to tell a story of what we're doing, and to sort of create public pedagogies about it. Because we don't have any secret sauce at Humanities Amped. We're all about like, let's just share, like everything we're trying to do, we're never gonna our curriculum is completely free on our website. Come get it. You know what I'm saying? Like we're not trying to just, make a buck out here. You know what I mean? Like we're actually just trying to do the work. And we know to do that, we got to be generous and we have to build knowledge frameworks. And so I think I'm uniquely interested in that at this point in my life. So that would be my dream. I'm almost like, this is really the first time that I'm sort of speaking that out. So that's a really good question. That writing piece. And we talk a little bit, like Destiny and Alex and, various other people in the Humanities Amped staff and in our community. We talk, like, oh man, we got to really carve out some time to reflect and document and write. And I'm thinking a lot about that lately and about the need to do that.
Well, I look forward to seeing what Humanities Amped will look like. I know during the time of this interview, we're dealing with the pandemic, but trouble doesn't last always. So I'm hoping that in about hopefully a year from now, we'll be having a different conversation. And I look forward to seeing Humanities Amped post-pandemic, just stronger and bigger and more robust. And I would love to see a book. Who knows, if you want to write some more, I would love to read that book. But as far as this conversation goes, I feel like I've learned so much more about you than I did before we started recording this. And I also feel as though I have a bit of optimism kind of restored inside of me, because you're someone who had a very similar experience with navigating Baton Rouge and trying to find your way, and then ended up coming back and being impactful. And it's something that I'm trying to do. And to see that journey has been tried and true, and it actually can happen, is really empowering for me, because it knows that things may be difficult, but it is possible to have a journey and then find your way back home, and then to make home the home that you want it to be for not only yourself, but for other people.
Well, thank you, Jahi, and thank you for being in that with me. You know, I mean, I do. Every time we talk to each other, I feel the ways that our lives resonate with one another. And, you know, you're making space and making community, and, you know, even just holding space for people to tell their stories, like this space right here. It's such a beautiful thing that you do. And I can also see how all the layers have come together and continue to come together. So, you know, it'll add up. It'll continue.
Yeah, I just wish I met you earlier in my life, because, you know, but things happen for a reason. So I always believe that. Anna, thank you so much for talking to me and sharing your story with not only me, but also others that may be watching here in Louisiana and abroad. And I hope that more people can listen to this story, and as Baton Rougians see that they need to play a role in making this a welcoming place. People that have left Baton Rouge to find a way to get back to their community. And for people that are not in Baton Rouge and are not from here, to see that we are trying to make our community a place that is richer and stronger. And we are not helpless. We know how to get things done, and we know how to see the beauty.